Dear Little One, an open letter to younger self. Chapter 10, When Ghosts Call Home, written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. The air bit into your skin that Sunday morning in Canada, a cold that felt sharper than usual. You sat by the window, staring out at the frost-kissed trees, but your mind was thousands of miles away in Rwanda. The night had been long, unforgiving. Sleep had refused you, leaving you wrestling with ghosts that had always lingered at the edges of your life. And now, one of those ghosts was taking shape. A man you had never known, yet whose absence had defined so much of who you were. Your father. You couldn't sleep. The hours stretched endlessly, each minute dragging like a weight on your chest. Your thoughts twisted and tangled, refusing to settle, and your body ached with the restlessness of exhaustion denied. So you turned to the only thing that ever gave you peace on nights like this. Your journal lay open on the table, its pages rough beneath your fingertips. A texture both familiar and foreign, like the memory of something long forgotten. It felt foreign because the words you once poured into it no longer matched the person you had become, as if the journal belonged to someone else entirely. You pressed the pen too hard, scratching the paper, each stroke a futile attempt to wrest clarity from chaos. The harsh scrape of the nib against the surface grated in your ears, as though even the words themselves resisted being written, as if the buried doubts and unspoken fears clawed at the edges of your mind, refusing to take form on the page. And still, as ink bled into the lines, nothing took shape. Nothing felt whole. Nothing felt right. You scribbled and scratched out words until the pages were filled with silences instead of sentences, the kind of silences that carried the weight of unsaid things, of questions too painful to ask, and truths too fragile to voice. What could you write to explain the ache of waiting for a man who had always been just out of reach? In Rwanda, it was already afternoon. Pasis, your cousin, was on her way to Kigali to meet him. They were supposed to meet in Gitarama, but at the last minute, your father changed the plan, insisting on Kigali instead. You didn't question it aloud, but in your heart, you wondered, was this a gesture of effort, or just another move in a game you had never been invited to play? A game where you stood to lose everything you had ever hoped for, while they risked nothing at all. He wants to meet in Kigali, Pasis had said. His voice steady but tinged with something you couldn't quite place. Concern, perhaps, or a quiet warning. You nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was surrender. The weight of it all pressed down on you, the questions you had never been able to ask, the silences that had filled entire years of your life. You weren't sure what you were waiting for anymore. It was 8 a.m. in Canada, and Pasis hadn't called yet. You stared at your phone at the way it sat there, unmoving. How do you wait for a ghost to call? You lay down, eyes wide open, tracing cracks in the ceiling as if they could stitch together the fragments of your story. But there were no answers, only more questions weaving through your mind like threads unraveling in the dark. The cracks were maps to nowhere, guiding you deeper into silence. Sleep didn't come. It never did. Instead, you left the phone on loudspeaker, the sound of its silence filling the room like an invisible presence, a lifeline you weren't sure you could hold. You clung to it, terrified of missing what you weren't even sure you wanted to hear. A voice. His voice. The voice of a man who had haunted you, shaped you, a phantom whose absence had become a part of your skin, your bones, your breath. Then the phone rang. It startled you, a sound too familiar, too ordinary for the weight it carried. Your chest tightened as if the air had suddenly thickened, your pulse quickening in time with the vibration against the table. The sound reverberated inside you, each ring amplifying the unease crawling up your spine. The vibration against the table seemed to echo inside you, each pulse a reminder of what was waiting on the other side. The light of the screen flickered in the dim room, casting a faint, shaky glow that barely held back the darkness. You reached for it slowly, your hand trembling as if your body already knew what your mind hadn't yet processed. For a moment, you hesitated. You could let it ring, let the moment pass, and remain in the quiet comfort of the life you'd known. A life built on silences, on unanswered questions. But something deeper stirred in you, a pull stronger than fear, stronger than the bitterness you carried. It wasn't hope, it was need. The need to know, not just to meet the man, but to finally face the shadow that had loomed over your entire life. The truth wasn't about him, it was about you, about understanding where you came from and why so much of your story had been buried in silence. Your hand moved before your mind could argue, before the years of doubt could hold you back. The moment wasn't passing, it was here, and you couldn't let it slip away. The ringing stopped as you picked up, leaving a silence that wasn't empty. It was thick with the weight of everything unsaid. It pressed against your chest, insistent, unforgiving, like the past itself demanding to be heard. In that silence, you could hear your heartbeat, slow, deliberate, carrying the burden of every year you had spent waiting. The air around you didn't still, it hovered, heavy and expectant, as if even the room understood that what came next would reshape the very foundation of who you were. "Hello?" Your voice barely broke the quiet, catching in your throat, as if it wasn't just a word but a question hanging in the air, trembling between hope and dread. Your chest tightened, your pulse quickening, and in that split second you felt the weight of years collapsing into this moment. Every silence, every unanswered question pressed against your ribs, making it hard to breathe. And still, you waited for his voice to break the years of absence. The air around you felt thicker, heavier, as if the entire room was listening, waiting for what would come next. "Hello?" You echoed into the silence, hoping for a reply that never came. The sound shattered the stillness, and you sat up quickly, the world tilting with the motion. On the screen wasn't a name, but a face, his face. The video call flickered, the image grainy, but there was no mistaking it. His eyes met yours, steady and searching, carrying a weight that you recognized immediately. It was the weight of time, of everything unsaid, of a history denied to you. For a moment, you couldn't breathe. There he was. Not a ghost, not a whisper, a man. You knew this call would change you forever. Yet you couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It wasn't fear. No, it was disbelief, thick and suffocating, born from the cracks silence had left in your life. And as you reached out with trembling hands, the walls seemed to lean in, listening, holding their breath along with you. Your hands trembled as you answered. "Hello? Hello?" A voice responded from the other end. The pause on the other end was a lifetime compressed into seconds. And then, that voice, deep, deliberate. The voice of someone who had lived through too many years alone. "It's me. I'm your father." The words hung there, solid, undeniable. They carried years of absence, and hearing them landed like a blow to your chest, sharp, sudden, knocking the air out of you. Time seemed to slow, stretching the space between heartbeats, each one heavy with the weight of what was being said, of what had never been said. It was like smoke from a fire long extinguished, clinging to the air, to your skin, to the walls around you, leaving behind the scent of everything that had been lost and could never be reclaimed. You had imagined this moment, but not like this. Not with your breath caught in your chest. Not with a silence that sat between you like a living thing, watching, waiting. They sat at a restaurant in Ribeiro, a hill overlooking Kigali. The view stretched out behind him, sprawling streets, rooftops catching the afternoon sun, the city buzzing quietly in the distance. His voice carried none of that warmth. Instead, it was low and deliberate, cutting through the air between you like a knife drawn slowly. "I'm sitting now," he said. The words felt almost tentative. You stared at his face on the screen, at the lines carved into his skin, at the eyes that seemed to carry both apology and defiance. For a moment, you were a child again, waiting for something, anything, that resembled love or an explanation. "Okay," you whispered. But it wasn't agreement. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a name hidden in whispers. He was a man, and you would hear him out. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I tried in 2014, again in 2017. I spoke to your uncles. I reached out." The knot in your chest tightened, like a rope pulled taut. The betrayal twisted itself tighter with each word. They had known. They had all known. Your voice cracked when it finally escaped you. "And no one told me." A sigh from the other end of the line. Not exasperation, but exhaustion. "I thought they would. I thought you knew." You let the silence fill the space between you. His regret seeped through the phone, but regret was not enough to dull the ache. "They didn't," you said. "Not my uncles, not my mother, not anyone." The silence stretched longer this time, vast and impenetrable. It was the silence of two worlds colliding, the life you lived and the one you had been denied. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I've wanted this for a long time." Your throat tightened, your voice trembling with the rage and sorrow you had carried for years. Do you know what it feels like to learn that your whole life has been shaped by a silence you never chose? To find out that everyone around you knew, and said nothing? It's like standing in a room full of people and screaming for help, only to realize they've all turned their backs, pretending not to hear. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, weighted with years of pain and wisdom, as if each word carried the weight of things he had seen and endured. You watched him carefully, searching for cracks in his calm exterior, but instead you saw a man who had lived through storms and emerged with a quiet resilience, a contrast to the storm inside you. "I wish I could change the past," he said softly, his voice faltering for a moment, as if weighing each word. "But I'm here now, and I know that isn't enough. Not yet." He paused, letting the silence stretch before speaking again, his gaze steady, filled with quiet regret. You let those words settle, sinking into the cracks of your anger. They didn't erase the betrayal. They didn't make you whole, but they cracked something open, a possibility, a path forward. Still, it wasn't enough. "What does that even mean?" you asked, your voice trembling with frustration. "You're here now, after all this time?" He held your gaze with a calm that felt unshakable. "It means I've carried the weight of my absence every day. I've thought about you, who you might be, where you were, every day. It means I'm here now to start again if you'll let me." You searched his face for signs of insincerity, for something to justify the hurt you were holding on to. Instead, you saw the quiet resilience of someone who had been broken and pieced himself back together, scarred but stronger. "I tried to find you," he continued, his voice never wavering. "I reached out to your uncles. I spoke to your mother. I did what I thought was right, but I see now that it wasn't enough." "And no one told me," you shot back, your voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sorrow. Your hands clenched into fists at your sides, nails digging into your palms. The bitterness in your voice was palpable, cutting through the air between you like a blade, each word sharpening the ache in your chest. "They knew you were looking for me, and they said nothing. Do you know how many times I asked? I started asking about you in 2012, all through 2013 as I was nearing the end of secondary school. Every time I asked, I was met with silence. And then, you say you reached out a year later, and still, nothing. Nothing. They knew I was desperately searching for you. They knew." His shoulders sagged slightly, not from weariness, but from acceptance of your anger. "I can't speak for them," he said, his tone soft but unwavering. I can only tell you that I never stopped hoping you'd know the truth one day." The words hung in the air, heavy with everything unsaid. You crossed your arms, your fingers digging into your skin. You thought wrong. A silence stretched between you, vast and impenetrable. The weight of years lay between you, years of absence, of silence, of unanswered questions. And yet, here you were, both searching for a way to bridge that distance. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said again, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "Not for a moment. You were never far from my mind. Even in the darkest times, you were there." You wanted to believe him. You wanted to take those words and hold them close, to let them fill the empty spaces inside you. The simplicity of his admission caught you off guard. For a moment, you both sat in silence, the enormity of the conversation settling between you. "I'm here now," he said again, his voice steady, filled with quiet determination. "And I want to know you, not as the child I left behind, but as the person you've become. I want to earn my place in your life." You met his gaze, searching once more for any trace of insincerity. There was none. His eyes held pain, yes, but also love, unspoken, but undeniably there. And for the first time, you allowed yourself to hope. "We'll see," you said. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a realization that had settled deep in your bones, one that found you in the quiet, when the noise of the world faded, and there was no one left to deceive, not even yourself. You didn't say it out loud. It sat heavy in your chest, like a weight you were finally learning how to carry. It wasn't about moving on. It was about holding yourself together when everything around you had fallen apart. You didn't say it out loud. It was a whisper to your soul, a murmur to the parts of you still aching for answers, the parts that carried a silence not of your own making. The weight of it pressed on your chest, like something ancient and immovable, tightening with every breath. It wasn't about letting go. It was about holding yourself together when the world around you fractured. It was a vow to reclaim your story, to move forward, even if no one else ever acknowledged the journey you had to take alone. When you finally confronted your grandmother, the last thread of doubt snapped, unraveling like fabric torn apart. Your heart pounded in your chest, each beat a dull echo of something final, something that could never be undone. Your breath caught, sharp, jagged, held hostage by the enormity of what you were about to hear. "Yes, we were informed," she said. Her voice was calm, unnervingly steady, like a stone tossed into still water, ripples spreading slowly outward. Her words didn't just slice through the air, they shattered it, each syllable colder than the last, leaving shards of silence in their wake. They cut through the noise in your mind, slicing it clean in half. The slap wasn't physical, but it stung all the same. A red-hot ache that burned beneath your skin, radiating outward until it touched everything you had ever held sacred. You searched her face, desperate for something, a flicker of remorse, a crack in the facade. But there was nothing. Her eyes were steady, unyielding, carved from granite, and you realized with a sinking certainty that there would be no apology. Not now, not ever. "We knew," she said again, the words falling heavy, landing with the weight of a hammer. You gripped the edge of the table, fingers digging into the wood, knuckles turning white. "Why?" you asked, your voice hoarse, raw with pain. "Why keep it from me?" Her gaze didn't waver. She crossed her arms, leaning back slightly as if to put distance between you, and with that simple gesture, you felt the room stretch wider, colder. It wasn't just space she created. It was dismissal, a quiet, unspoken statement that your pain was inconsequential, that your questions didn't deserve answers. The gap between you grew, a chasm that left you more alone than before you'd spoken. It wasn't for you to know. she said, her tone final, each word a stone dropped into the silence. We did what we thought was best. Best for whom? You wanted to scream. But the words caught in your throat, trapped beneath the weight of your rage. Your chest tightened, your breath quickening, as if every unspoken question you had ever asked was fighting its way out, clawing at your ribs. The betrayal settled inside you like a cold, unmovable thing. It wasn't just about your father anymore. It was about trust. It was about the foundation of your family's love, now cracked and crumbling. They had spoken of unity, of kinship, of bonds that could never be broken. But they had kept this essential truth from you. They had stolen your chance to know him. They had rewritten your story without your consent. Your throat tightened. You owed me the truth, you said, each word trembling with barely contained fury. You owe me an apology. Everyone who knew owes me an apology. Her expression didn't change. If anything, her gaze hardened. No, she said, her tone sharp, unrepentant. I am not apologizing for anything. The room tilted. The weight of her refusal pressed down on you, twisting your insides. The sickness that rose in you wasn't just nausea. It was something deeper, something ancient, clawing its way out. It twisted and writhed, growing with every unanswered question, pressing against your ribs until it felt like you might shatter from within. The pain wasn't new. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for a moment like this to surface. It wasn't grief anymore. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that cuts clean through the noise, like a blade finding its mark. The fog lifted, and with it came the brutal truth. You had been walking in circles, guided by their silence, trapped in a story they had written without you. They had known all along, and they hadn't cared. Not about your search for answers, not about the years of longing that stretched between you. They hadn't cared when you were a boy, desperate for a name to anchor yourself, a tether to the world that always felt just out of reach. They hadn't cared when you sat quietly at family gatherings, absorbing their laughter, their stories, all of it carefully constructed to keep you on the outside. You were the reminder of a mistake they couldn't undo, a bastard child who carried the burden of their shame. And so they erased you, not with cruelty, but with indifference, the kind of dismissal that sinks into your bones, that teaches you from an early age that you do not matter. You were an afterthought, a shadow on the periphery of their perfect picture, and their silence wasn't accidental. It was the cold, calculated decision to keep you wandering in the dark, knowing you'd either lose yourself in it or learn to live without light. Their silence wasn't just neglect, it was a decision, a cruel choice to leave you wandering in the dark. It was the kind of silence that crept into every corner of your life, the kind that made you question your own worth before you even understood what worth was. They saw your longing, those silent pleas for acknowledgement, and turned their backs. It wasn't ignorance, it was avoidance. You weren't a child to them, you were a consequence. And consequences were meant to be hidden, forgotten, erased. Their silence told you, again and again, that you were an inconvenience, an afterthought, a shadow best left out of the light. And what hurt most was how easily they did it, how seamlessly they went on with their lives, building a world where you were an unspoken footnote, a name left out of stories told at the dinner table. Their indifference became your burden to carry, and they never once considered how heavy that weight would become. And now, with everything laid bare, you saw it for what it was, a betrayal honed with precision, like a blade sharpened by hands that knew exactly where to cut. It wasn't just about what they did, it was about what they refused to do. They refused to see you, to acknowledge your existence as something, more than a reminder of what they wanted to forget. You saw yourself reflected in their indifference, a child who had learned too early to keep his needs small, his presence quiet, because asking for more only invited disappointment. It wasn't a lesson you chose to learn. It was one imposed upon you, etched into your very being by the looks that passed over you without landing, by the hands that never reached out to pull you in. You learned to exist in the background, to occupy as little space as possible, because even your presence was a reminder of something they would rather not face. And in the quiet moments when the noise of family faded and you were left alone with yourself, you felt that absence like a weight pressing down, reminding you that you were an inconvenience they wished they could erase entirely. You learned to fend for yourself at an age when other children were still being guided. By the time you were 11, you were already working, buying yourself clothes, school supplies. Everything beyond the food placed on the table was up to you. You couldn't afford to wait for love to be offered, so you searched for it in every corner of your small world. You wrote letters to girls your age, pouring out words in the hope that someone would understand the ache inside you. But they never did. They whispered about you instead, about how you carried yourself like a man twice your age. Too serious, too proud, too unreachable. Betrayed by your own overconfidence, you stood apart, a boy longing for connection yet always falling short. They saw the mask of self-reliance, not the child beneath it, and so they left you in the shadows, just like your family had. And yet, they admired you from a distance. They whispered about your poise, your confidence, your determination to stand tall when everything around you conspired to bring you low. But admiration from afar is no substitute for love. Their respect never bridged the chasm of loneliness. They marveled at your strength but never questioned what it had cost you to build it. And with each rejection, the silence around you grew heavier, solidifying into the unshakable belief that you were never meant to be seen. But respect without understanding is hollow, and admiration without love is a wound that never heals. It reminded you of your family, how they too kept their distance, watching you endure without ever stepping in. Their silence wasn't indifference. It was a judgment, a quiet verdict passed on your existence. You carried that verdict like a scar, a reminder that you had been cast aside long before you ever sought their approval. And as you traced the lines of your own story, you saw how the betrayal extended beyond the walls of the family home. It shaped how you walked through the world, how you learned to keep your guard up, to show only the mask they expected. But masks can only hide so much. Beneath it, the ache remained, the longing for someone, anyone, to see you, to see past the mask, to reach for the child who had always been left out, the one who learned too young that love was conditional, given only to those who fit neatly into the family's image. And now, standing in the wreckage of those beliefs, you saw the betrayal clearly. It wasn't just what they had done, it was what they refused to do. They refused to hold you in your humanity. They refused to let you belong. The clarity of this realization cut deeper than the betrayal itself. It forced you to confront a truth you had always avoided. They had written you out of the family story long before you ever realized you had a place in it. They had chosen to pretend you didn't exist, to scrub you from their memories, as if you were a stain they couldn't bear to acknowledge. And now, standing in the ruins of what you once believed was love, you saw that their silence wasn't just an oversight. It was a verdict. Cold, deliberate, and final. It wasn't just the unanswered questions that hurt. It was the awareness that every moment of silence had been filled with intention. Each omission, each withheld truth was a calculated move to keep you on the outside, wandering through a life that never truly felt like yours. They hadn't forgotten you. No, that would have been too kind. They had dismissed you, erased you in a way that left you holding the burden of their shame, their secrets, their refusal to claim you as their own. And every choice they made, every story they told that didn't include you, cut deeper. It wasn't just that they lied. It was that they never saw you as someone worthy of the truth. The lie wasn't in what they said, it was in what they refused to say. The silence had been their weapon, wielded with precision to keep you small, to keep you doubting, to make sure you never asked for more than the scraps of affection they occasionally tossed your way. And now, in the stark light of clarity, you understood something you hadn't dared to admit before. You were never meant to belong. Not to them. They had decided long ago that you would always be on the margins, that your story would always remain untold. that you would be a ghost walking among them. But now that ghost had a voice, and you were done letting their silence define you. You began to plot your next steps with a clarity that burned through the fog of longing and uncertainty. Boundaries would be drawn, not out of anger, but out of necessity, a declaration that your worth would no longer be dictated by those who had chosen to ignore it. Ties would be cut, clean and precise, like severing a lifeline that had never truly been yours. A lifeline they dangled in front of you, making you believe you needed their acceptance to breathe. But you never did. The air was yours to claim, a birthright they tried to deny but never had the power to take. It was the breath you drew now, steady, deliberate, filled with the resolve to be seen on your own terms. They could no longer dictate the narrative of your life, nor could they hold the keys to your belonging. That belonged to you and you alone. The life they withheld wasn't theirs to grant. It never was. They had no right to define your worth, no claim over the path you chose to walk. And now, standing in the light of your own clarity, you saw that the life you were building was yours to claim, yours to own, and theirs to lose. And so cutting that tie wasn't loss, it was liberation. It was the shedding of chains you hadn't realized you'd been dragging behind you for years, the quiet sound of shackles falling away. Those who had proven they didn't truly want you, not as you were, not in your entirety, would no longer have a claim on any part of you. They had carved out a space for you on the margins, but now you were reclaiming yourself, piece by piece, step by step, until there was nothing left for them to hold on to. And as that realization settled in, the ache in your chest shifted. It wasn't just from the betrayal. It was the weight of freedom taking shape, sharp and unfamiliar, like the first breath after being underwater too long. It was the realization that survival had never been enough. Not for you. You wanted more than to endure. You wanted to live fully, without the weight of their judgments dragging you down. This wasn't about vengeance or making them see what they had done. No, this was about reclaiming the parts of yourself they had tried to bury. It was about stepping out of the shadows they had cast over your life and declaring your existence without apology. You weren't just leaving them behind. You were leaving behind the version of yourself that had waited too long to be seen, too long to be loved on someone else's terms. You were claiming your own story, not the one they told, not the one they ignored, but the one you would write with your own hands, in your own voice. And this time, there would be no silence to hold you back. Every word, every step forward would be yours, and yours alone. And yet, as the journey of reclaiming yourself began, there remained a quiet ache, a need to see what had been hidden for so long. You had spent years chasing shadows, looking for answers that always seemed just out of reach. And now, seeing Passis sitting across from the man who had been a ghost in your life, you saw that the search had never been about finding him. It had been about finding yourself. Passis wasn't asking questions, but rather relating to your father as if they had known each other for a lifetime. The familiarity in their exchange unsettled you at first. How could they, who had been apart for so long, speak as though no time had passed? But it was the ease in your father's responses that began to shift something inside you. His voice carried no defensiveness, no urgency to explain himself, only the quiet assurance of a man who had made peace with his past. It wasn't the words he spoke that mattered. It was the way he listened, the way he held space for Passis' words without interruption, without judgment. The bond between them was a recognition of something deeper than history. It was shared pain, shared survival. And in that connection, you began to see the contours of your own story reflected back at you. This man, who had lived in the shadows of your mind for so long, wasn't a figure of shame or regret. He was a man who bore the weight of his choices with grace, who had found a way to carry his scars without letting them define him. And as you watched him, his calmness, his presence, you saw for the first time that your strength wasn't born from rejection or isolation. It was in your blood, carried in the steady resilience of a man who had always existed, even when he was absent. It struck you then. You weren't looking at a stranger. You were looking at a reflection. And maybe, just maybe, you weren't as alone in your story as you had once believed. And that's when you began to see it. Your father's warmth, his free spirit, the quiet strength in his steady gaze. He wasn't just answering words, he was responding to a person, engaging fully in a way that made it clear he valued what was being said. His calmness wasn't something rehearsed. It was earned, carved out through years of survival, through scars both seen and unseen. He listened with intent, never rushing, never dismissing. And in his calmness, you saw something you hadn't expected, a reflection of yourself. The way he carried himself, unburdened by guilt, steady in his presence, reminded you that strength wasn't loud, it was quiet resilience. There was no pretense, no guarded answers. He spoke to passes with the ease of someone who had made peace with his own story. And in that, you began to see traces of yourself reflected in his demeanor. His warmth wasn't performative, it was lived, weathered by time and tempered by loss. His presence wasn't conditional, it was steady, grounded in a calm assurance that comes only from surviving what others wouldn't dare to endure. And in those moments you realized that the marks of your identity had been there all along, hidden in his quiet resilience. It wasn't just his calm that mirrored something within you. It was the way he moved through the conversation without demanding anything in return, the way he held space without needing to fill it with explanations or excuses. For so long, you had carried your own resilience as a burden, mistaking it for isolation. But here, in your father's steady gaze, you saw a different truth. Strength wasn't in the loud declarations or the need to prove oneself. It was in the quiet dignity of being, of standing firm even when the world had turned its back. And that realization began to shift something within you. It softened the edges of your anger, not erasing it, but giving it form, giving it purpose. In seeing him, you saw yourself, not the boy who had been left behind, but the person you were becoming, shaped not by their silence, but by your own will to endure. This wasn't the ending of your journey. It was a beginning. And perhaps, in learning to see him, you were also learning to see yourself, not in the image they tried to erase, but in the fragments that endured despite it all. The journey wasn't over. It would never be over. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a process, slow and uneven, like tides pulling away at the shore. But one thing was certain. You were done carrying the weight of their silence, done waiting for apologies that would never come. From here on, you would move forward, on your terms. And with each step, the shadows they cast over your life grew fainter, receding into the distance until all that remained was your own light, steady and unshaken. You asked him to tell you something about his family, unsure of what you were searching for, but needing to hear it all the same. "You are the firstborn," he said, with a quiet pride that caught you off guard. Of course you were. That part you knew. But his voice carried more than just a fact. It carried a recognition, an acknowledgement of something that had always been denied to you. "You have 3 sisters," he continued, as if offering pieces of a puzzle you hadn't realized you were still trying to solve. "One is a professor in Kigali, the other is married, and the youngest, the last-born, she's at home, she has a child." Each word landed softly, yet with weight, filling the quiet between you, like ripples spreading across still water. There was no rush in his voice, no need to explain further, just the quiet rhythm of someone speaking a truth they had carried for too long. He wasn't giving you a history lesson. He was handing you fragments of your own reflection, pieced together through time and distance. And in his calm, steady tone, you heard something you hadn't expected: belonging. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet echo, something that had been waiting for you all along, hidden in the spaces between words, in the steady cadence of his voice. It wasn't something given. It was something remembered. You both sat in a shared stillness, broken only by the quiet shuffle of breath. His gaze was steady, yet distant, eyes tracing shapes in the dust of unspoken words. The pause lingered over the line, neither of you rushing to fill it. The silence stretched across the line, vast and unyielding, amplifying the weight of what remained unsaid. The air hung heavy, dense with an old sorrow, waiting to break free like the ache of a wound too long hidden. It pressed inward, testing the edges of silence, demanding words that had been held back for too many years. And then, without fully knowing why, you let the question slip. Who are we? It felt less like a question and more like an offering to the past, a way of calling forth what had been buried. He stood still, as if feeling the weight of what he carried, before releasing it, slow and reverent, like a chant rising from ancient stones. "I am Ndayishimiye," he said, each syllable unfolding like smoke curling toward unseen altars. Ndayishimiye, born of Ndekezi, Ndekezi, born of Kimonyo, and Kimonyo, born of Musuhuke. Each name landed like a hammer on ancient iron, ringing through the years with a resonance that lingered between you, each name striking with the weight of something both familiar and distant. And with each name, it felt as though time shifted, not with grand gestures, but subtly, shadows forming in the quiet, and memories weaving themselves into the space around you. "In all our lineage," he continued, his voice steady, "it is Musuhuke who stands out in the history books. He served at the king's palace, under Umwami Rutarindwa. Musuhuke was a high-ranking soldier in Rutarindwa's army." Patsis nodded along. He said softly, his voice carrying something between agreement and reverence. "Yes, yes." It was as if he too recognized the quiet pull of those names, a shared burden of memory slipping into the silence between you. His words bent time, folding the coup at Rukunshu into the space between breaths, the air now charged with histories hidden in the dust. Musuhuki's story surfaced briefly, a flicker of something distant, almost forgotten. A time of upheaval, a palace lost to flames, and a name whispered through the cracks of history. The faint trace of burning lingered in the mind, indistinct and fleeting, before slipping through like sand. What mattered was the weight it left behind. The telling wasn't loud, nor was it soft. It was steady, like a drumbeat heard through the soles of your feet. The past spoke through him, not in stories but in the rhythm of a heartbeat, steady and persistent, as if each name whispered carried the weight of generations coursing through his veins. And as his words settled, you felt the room stretch, layers of time folding over one another, binding past to present to memory. There was no boast, no glory, just echoes in the marrow of things. Truth carried like a stone smoothed by rivers, a shape worn by time, but unbroken. "And so, my son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of distant thunder, reverberating through the quiet air. "You are Ndayishimiye, the son of Ndayishimiye. Ndayishimiye, born of Ndekezi. Ndekezi, born of Kimonyo. And Kimonyo, born of Musuhuke." These weren't just names. They were whispers from the bones of the earth, carried on the wind like ancient prayers slipping through cracks in the stones. Memory crept like roots in the dark, twisting deeper, past what can be seen, where shadows breathe and soil remembers. Each name carried the scent of rain on forgotten graves, and the weight of time pressing upward toward light. With each name, something stirred, an ancient hum, neither loud nor soft, but persistent, a rhythm out of step with the present moment. It wasn't belonging that stirred, but recognition, as though your blood recalled something your mind could not hold, the pulse of stories etched in the marrow of your being. And in that moment, you understood. The past was not a burden, but a gift. You carried them all with you, in your name, in your blood. Not a chain to weigh you down, but a tether to those who came before, a lifeline reaching back through time. Passus watched you closely, his gaze steady and knowing. "You feel it now, don't you?" he asked. There was no judgment in his voice, only understanding. The silence that followed was lighter somehow, not empty, but waiting. Neither of you rushed to fill it. You nodded again, this time with a quiet certainty. The weight of centuries pressed into your chest, not as a burden, but as breath, slow and steady, filling a void that had long gone unnamed. "Mother is still alive," you began, your voice distant, tracing the edges of a story too old to hold. "She lives in Burundi," you said, the words settling slowly like dust on forgotten roads. "She had many lives, one for each promise made to her, and one for each promise she made in return, but they all slipped away." There was a pause, the kind that gathers shadows. "And in the end?" His voice moved softly, like a breath stirring dust in a forgotten room, hesitant to disturb what lay settled. "In the end," you murmured, "she stood alone, betrayed by time and by those who once held her close. The wind moved through her stories, scattering them across empty fields, too faint to follow, too distant to hold. They brushed past like whispers through tall grass, heard but never grasped, fading before they could settle. And when the wind stilled, there was only quiet, a silence so vast it seemed to hum beneath the surface, the kind that fills forgotten places where echoes go to rest. Her stories lingered there, waiting, not for someone to find them, but for someone to remember they had been told. Each one carried the ache of promises broken and names spoken too late. The call lingered for a few more beats, stretched between distances that could never be crossed. The silence between you seemed to shift, not seeking words but folding in on itself, like the creak of old wood beneath the weight of forgotten footsteps. A presence carried from the past, too ancient to name. Finally, your voice returned, quieter now, the sound of something bending beneath its own weight. "I'll let you go," you said, though the words barely seemed yours, slipping into the stillness as though they had been waiting there all along. And in that moment, it wasn't parting. It was surrender, an offering made to time itself, to carry what could no longer be held. "Thank you. I will be in touch soon," you continued, the words brittle, as though they might crumble under the weight of what passed between you. They hung in the air briefly, then dissolved into the silence that followed. The line clicked, leaving you with the silence, not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of what you now carried, steady as the beat of your heart.